the podcast discussing Montgomery County, Maryland, and beyond issues where you are part of the show. I'm your host, Jason Makstein, and today we have co-host Esther Wells and longtime special education lawyer Kim Glassman to talk about special education advocacy in MCPS. For this episode, Kim will be giving a presentation about the different parts of special education advocacy, and our chats will be open for questions and comments the whole time. So chime in, and your comments may end up on the stream. So with that, I will hand it over to Kim and her presentation.
Sure. So I will just, jump right in and get started. And I have set this up as kind of a nuts and bolts A to Z talk about special education. And I would say, Esther, jump in and ask questions if you feel like I need to clarify something or explain something better, or even if you just want to have a bit of dialogue about the subject. But I will just start going through the slides. A little bit about me is that I have represented parents in special education cases going back almost 20 years, which seems impossible because I'm not that old. But I have been in hundreds of IEP meetings, mediations, due process hearings in district court, and I practice in both DC and Maryland. I worked as an attorney on the CCAM panel, where we have a special education panel in the district. And in my free time, I'm also a PTA president. So I spend a lot of my time focused on education and education advocacy. I kind of wanted to just start at the beginning of how do I even start the process? What do I do? Where do I go? And I would say anytime that you're concerned that your child may have special education needs, you can request evaluations in writing. And some red flags for that can include poor grades, lack of progress on those standardized tests we all love so much. If you are getting a lot of communication home, that your child is having a hard time, they need to be picked up, they can't go on that field trip next week because they just can't maintain behavioral expectations, these are things that warrant a conversation. Once you make a request in writing, MCPS will convene a meeting to discuss these concerns, discuss whether there's a suspected disability, and if so, what areas need to be evaluated. This is most often going to start with psychological and educational testing. That is a basic cognitive assessment, basic academic assessments in reading, writing, and math. If there are concerns around potential autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, social emotional needs, there will be a series of rating scales to look into that area of concern. And it could also include related services like speech or occupational therapy. There's also other related services that are less often coming up, like physical therapy and vision services. So this is your step one, is getting the evaluations done and underway. So once you send that request in writing, the evaluations have to be done within 90 days of that written request to your principal, or 60 days from the signed consent. And after that, the evaluations are complete. The IEP team comes together to determine eligibility, and we look at one of 13 potential disability classifications. The most common one we see are specific learning disability, autism spectrum disorder, emotional disability, other health impairment, which covers ADHD, and for our little ones, developmental delay. There's also deaf blindness, physical impairment, and other speech language impairment. So if you are eligible under one of those 13 categories, an IEP must be developed within 30 days. So you can see from the start, you're potentially evaluating, and it is 3 months later before you're even getting started with services. So that is why I tell families, if you have a question or you have a doubt, evaluating means you're looking for a suspected disability. It does not mean that we automatically assume eligibility, we make any assumptions about what that might look like. It just means we have a question that we are concerned about. Once eligible, an IEP must be in place as soon as possible after it is created, and must be in place at the start of each school year. So it's not necessarily going to be the very next day, but as soon as we can get that schedule together so that the necessary special educators and related service providers can get your kiddo on their caseload is when it must be in place. And IEPs have to be reviewed at least once a year to determine progress and to review and revise the IEP. Progress is reported quarterly on your IEP goals and objectives. So in Maryland, if you ever get an IEP progress report that says not making sufficient progress, you also have to have an IEP meeting to discuss that. So it is at least once a year, more often that if there is a notation of not making progress, but you could also request periodic reviews at any time. How's my speed? Am I doing okay, Esther?
Yeah, no, definitely want to jump in and maybe pick your brain a little bit thus far. And so just kind of introducing myself to maybe audience members that don't know me. So I am Esther Wells, and I'm a mom of a son that has autism spectrum disorder, ASD, and ADHD. And I feel that my experience was unique when it came to recognizing that he had autism. It was truly his pediatrician that noticed at his milestone appointments that certain things that was expected he didn't meet. And so I think that early detection was key for saying, is this something here? Because I was a first brand new mom, very young, not knowing what typical milestones were. And so I think definitely your pediatrician is really important in helping you navigate that if your child is not meeting their milestones at those appointments. That would be kind of your initial, desire for an evaluation. What would you thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, that's essentially what those well baby checkups are for. You're doing an assessment of, is this baby, toddler, preschooler meeting milestones?
Right.
And if they're not meeting milestones, what do we do about it? If you're between the ages of 1 and 3 or 0 and 3, you can get referred for early childhood assessments. 3 and up, you can be referred to the school district for regular IEP assessments.
Right. And for us, we were able to get that early diagnosis of developmental delay, which I believe is the main category you can have at such a young age. You can't diagnose autism until age 3. But we were able to get access to the PEP program. I'm sorry, not PEP program, infants and toddlers. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that and how valuable of a service that is leading into IEP and PEP.
Yes, infants and toddlers is your first entry to intervention services.
Yeah.
And can be really critical. And I think when you're looking at things like potential autism or speech language delays, that is where a lot of that is captured early on.
Yeah.
And that is exactly why when you're at the doctor's appointment, they're asking you, how many words does your child say? Are they making eye contact? Do they respond appropriately in social situations? All of those questions are trying to find out, might there be a developmental delay that requires early intervention?
Right. And one of the things I want to add that was a little bit more subtle was that my son, he wouldn't chew his food. He would just swallow the whole parts. And I'm thinking nothing of it, like, it's not a big deal. But that was part of the test. I think it was like a 6-part test or something like that. But it was something as subtle as he keeps choking on his food. So as a new mom, again, if your mom instincts is kicking in, like this just doesn't feel right, just elevate your voice, bring it up to your pediatrician and have them tell you, oh, that's okay. Don't just dismiss certain things if it doesn't feel right.
And then if your pediatrician recommends reaching out to infants and toddlers, let them do that assessment to figure out what is it that your child might need, or maybe they're not quite eligible. When my youngest was a toddler, we had him assessed through Child Find because he was not talking as much as his siblings did, which his siblings were big talkers. And when they came out and did that initial screening, his speech language was a little bit below, but his fine and gross motor was advanced. So we did not qualify for services because we didn't have enough of a delay in anything. But they were also able to say, he's not talking as much. It's a tiny bit delayed, but it's not that much that he would be eligible. Gave us some things that we could do at home and some reassurance that we could keep plugging along.
Right. And one of the things after, and again, being a brand new mom, not ever being around someone that has different abilities, it was both comforting for the infants and toddlers assessors that I believe are through MCPS to come to my home and to do the initial assessment. But when they did mention that he had developmental delays, I feel like trying to get ready for that type of diagnosis of your child, definitely seeking out counseling or therapy, or that community would be really important, just to help you navigate, okay, now this new world, how can I really support my child? How can I really advocate for my child? So just keeping the parents in mind when you do enter into the world of developmental delay and developmental disability, that there's a whole community out there that is going to, wrap around you and help you through the process.
Definitely. And I don't know if it exists in infants and toddlers, but in PEP and preschool services, they have that parent coordinator role. And that person's role is really valuable in educating parents on what on earth is this process and how do I do it and what happens next.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a role that ends once you enter kindergarten. So
Right.
I think to your point, Esther, anytime you're new to this world of services, understanding what you're getting into is really important.
Yes.
Anything more over here, or should I continue on?
Yeah, no, go for it.
Okay. So another thing that must happen is that every 3 years we determine continued eligibility for services. Sometimes that means you are getting a full reevaluation in all of the areas of disability, and sometimes that means we know what your child's disability and needs are. We don't need to do a full reevaluation. We might just need to get some updated educational levels. Anyone who is identified as having a developmental delay, though, between the ages of 7 and 9, we have to determine what their big kid disability might be if they're eligible. So you do have to get assessed at that stage at the very least. I've seen it vary wildly for lots of kids when they get reevaluated and when they don't. And I think sometimes you really just need updated baselines. You need to have apples to apples comparisons of where your kiddo was 3 years ago to where they are today. And sometimes your child is who they are, and you might not need those formal assessments to keep moving through the IEP process. So what happens when things go wrong? What do I do if I have a concern? I think this is when most people find their way to an attorney. And sometimes people do that early on, and sometimes people like to go through this chain of command on their own, and sometimes people get frustrated or just don't want to be on their own. So any of these steps can be done up until the very end of the ladder without any sort of representation. But the first thing that you can do is, if you're concerned or you're upset or you feel like things aren't going well, is to call for an IEP meeting. You can request one anytime. You do not have to wait for your annual review or a special date on the calendar. You could also elevate it from the case manager to the resource teacher if you're in middle or high school, or your program manager if you're in a discrete program. So if you're not getting it's kind of the same thing as start with your classroom teacher, work your way up to administration. The same thing exists within special education. From your resource teacher, you have your school level administrator, and then MCPS has area special education supervisors and why am I blanking on the title? Instructional support personnel. Sorry, totally blanking on a title there. But within each cluster, there are one or two people assigned who are providing supervisory support at the cluster level, and can often problem solve if the school level is not working for you. Then from there, you get into resolution and compliance. Resolution and compliance has an administrative review process, which I will go into detail about in a moment. And above that is formal dispute resolution, where we have mediation, due process, and state complaints. I would say that I would not recommend anyone go down a due process road without some form of representation, but most other things can be done on your own or by doing some research. So sometimes, like I said, folks feel at step one, I would like to have an attorney. I have had clients that I've gone to every IEP meeting from preschool through high school graduation. And I have cases where I come in because everything's a big mess, family is very frustrated, and they need their mess unmessy. So any of those things are times when I come into the process. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I know for me, I have not seeked out legal services, but I think it was because I didn't know that these channels were here. So that's so great that you're able to share that with us because, again, being new to it and not knowing what your rights are as a parent or, how to advocate for your child, but still, seeing your school as a partnership with you raising your children. I have never thought like that was something I could have done to expedite some of the results that I needed, especially during the pandemic, which is where a lot of the balls were dropped for me in my situation with my family, where an MCPS decided to close schools. Within, I think they said 2 weeks and handing out laptops. And I think my son spent the first 2 weeks asking my teacher asking his teacher, why are you on my computer every day? Why are we here? Why am I at home? And so I think in moments like that, in hindsight, that it would have been great to engage your services to truly navigate, well, is this correct? A lot of times we just don't know our rights. And so we don't know when to raise our hands for help.
Absolutely. And I think, at every single IEP meeting, you get offered your procedural safeguards, and it's this 70 some odd page document that goes through everything that you might have a right to. And that's a lot of information. And I also think families you think that when you bring an attorney or you bring an advocate, that you are harming your relationship with your child's school. And I would say that certainly happens sometimes, but it should not be the outcome. My role in this process and any attorney's role in this process is not to, come in, pound fists, and demand the moon, the star, and the sun. We really need to work collaboratively. It's just that sometimes I know how to navigate the process in a way that mom and dad might not. So it takes that pressure off.
Yes.
I could say like it lets me be the bad guy. I'm more or less not a bad guy. It
No.
happens occasionally, but we all disagree. You can disagree respectfully. And we're all here because we want to help the student be successful.
That's right.
So, I always say start with an email, go up the chain of command. If you do not receive a response, send a follow up, add that next person in the chain of command. My secret phrase for when I'm being ignored is to request the courtesy of a response to my email. And this usually reminds people that they are being discourteous. I have found with many school districts, sometimes the answer is no. And rather than saying so, they just let it go and hope that you don't ask for this thing again. And sometimes we just need an answer. So the courtesy of a response seems to work. Oh, I clicked too many times. And then again, anytime that your email and your phone calls are not successful, you can go through all of the various dispute resolution processes. So I am going to talk about informal dispute resolution and then formal dispute resolution. So your kind of non-legal working together options or even soliciting help from the central office, and then your more legal options that are going outside of MCPS for support, which would be the state complaint mediation and due process complaints. So every time there's a disagreement at an IEP meeting, you should see that documented in your prior written notice. At the end of every IEP meeting, within 5 days of the meeting, you get the finalized document and the prior written notice, which is a summary of what occurred. And the name confuses everyone because it says prior written notice, but it comes after the meeting. So confusing thing number like 700 about special education. And the prior written notice is supposed to explain anything that did occur, but also anything that was considered or requested and did not occur. A very basic example is we go to a meeting, we request that a student be evaluated for special education consideration, and the school system says we don't suspect a disability, so we don't want to proceed with the evaluations at this time. They should be documenting what led to that decision. So I request evaluation, school says, well, we don't think they're really needed because the student is now in intervention and making slow and steady progress. So we'd like to continue that first. A basic description of what occurred should come in that document. And then if you disagree with a decision, you can follow up through your various dispute resolution documents, and I will go through those separately through each of them. Something I always tell parents, and when I'm at meetings myself, if there is a point of disagreement that is important, that is when I pause to say, it seems like we're not reaching agreement on this. Can you please document this and we can move on? But it's also okay to end a meeting when things are no longer productive. If you're talking in circles, if you're getting frustrated, if you keep asking something and you're not getting anywhere, there are times where, even as an attorney, I will say, this meeting is no longer productive. Let's just agree to disagree and conclude. Please document my disagreement. If you're a parent and you're on your own and you feel like you're in over your head, you can do the same thing. You can say, this meeting is no longer productive. It's not working for me. I would like to end where we are. I might request a new meeting and bring bring an advocate or a friend or an attorney with me, but document my disagreement and let's no longer engage in this negative conversation. So informal dispute resolution, this is where you can find instructional specialists. That's the phrase I was looking for before. So we can share out the presentation later, but on the MCPS website, you can find the supervisors and instructional specialists by cluster. Parents can reach out to the supervisors. You can invite them to a meeting. If you have a student in a discrete program, like the learning centers or social emotional support program, you could request a representative from the program come. You don't have to wait for the school to do it. You can ask for those things on your own. And the administrative review process is something MCPS Resolution and Compliance Unit is what they sound like. They're here to help resolve problems. And if you feel like something was just handled poorly and violated your rights or your students' rights, you can ask MCPS to check themselves. This is not something I used often as an attorney because for the most part, I'm going to do something in a more formal way. But the form that you can fill out and invoke the process is on the MCPS website. Decisions are supposed to be made within 20 days. And if you disagree with the administrative review, all of your other due process rights remain intact. I would say, from my perspective, the pros are this is something you can do independently as a parent. You don't really need help to do it. You need to write a letter that explains what the issue is. But then you're relying on MCPS to investigate itself and perhaps discipline itself or make a finding against itself. Sometimes they do that, sometimes they don't. And if you have an administrative review, but you feel like it's taking too long or you change your mind and you want to go down due process or a state complaint, once you file something formally, it ends the administrative review and they don't reach a conclusion. Any questions, Esther?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I hope myself or parents, don't have to escalate it to the state level, but this is really good information so that we feel empowered that as we advocate for our children, that the school system needs to ensure that we can keep up with the conversation and ultimately agree that this is in the child's best interest. And so this is really helpful.
And I just wanted to chime in as well, just to the followers, and people watching. If you have any questions, comment it in the chat so we can see it, and we'll read it aloud, or it may come up on the chat, so that you can have your questions asked as well.
So I will talk a bit about state complaints. A state complaint can be filed by an individual or an organization. I have on occasion filed state complaints on behalf of student A and all similarly situated students. So if I notice a pattern of something occurring, a state complaint can address any violation of state or federal law within 1 year of filing. And then the Maryland State Department of Education investigates. They determine if there is a legal violation. They issue a letter of finding with their conclusions and any corrective actions that the school system has to take. I would say state complaints are more useful for things that are pretty black and white. my student is supposed to receive speech language services. There has not been a speech therapist for the last 5 months because the position has been vacant. I would like a remedy for those missed services. Anything that is more substantive or more subjective is harder to do in an investigation that is talking to both sides and reading documents. You cannot appeal a state complaint finding, but you can file a due process complaint on the same issue and bring it before an administrative law judge. Mediation can be requested for any alleged denial of FAPE related to the placement, evaluation, or identification of a student with a disability. You can file a mediation as its own standalone request. You do not have to attach it to a due process complaint, but you can. Both parties have to consent to mediation. Mediation is just a way to solve a dispute without having litigation. And an administrative law judge presides over it. Oftentimes, they help with the drafting process, particularly if the mediation is between MCPS and a parent who is not represented. Mediations can be a very good way to move forward a stuck conversation. I think the most important piece, though, is that both parties have to agree to mediate. And I've had many situations where my clients and the family wanted to mediate and the school system did not agree because their position was not changing. So mediation was not going to be a beneficial conversation. A due process complaint is something that either a parent or a school may file for any alleged violation or denial of FAPE within 2 years of the legal violation or 2 years of when the family knew or should have known. School districts can also file due process complaints. The times where it most often comes up where the school system is filing is if a parent requests an independent educational evaluation. In that case, MCPS has two choices: to pay for it or to file against the parent, defending the validity of their testing. Or when a student is found, is recommended as eligible for alternative learning outcomes and the parent does not consent, the only way the school district can force consent is via a due process complaint. And these are administrative lawsuits filed against the school system. They go before administrative law judges. They're kind of like a bench trial. Before a hearing can occur, there must either be a mediation or a resolution session. A resolution session is exactly what it sounds like. It's an opportunity to resolve a complaint, but it's not with an administrative law judge. It's just the parties. And mediation can be in place of a resolution session when both parties consent. Agreements are enforceable in state court, but if you don't reach an agreement, you are going to something that looks like a trial. Hearings can be lengthy. Each party presents their evidence. Evidence is generally due 5 business days before the hearing. I'm in the middle of a disclosure now that's somewhere around 300 pages. Both parties trade their documents. We call our witnesses. Hearings, I would say, typically run between 3 and 5 days. So these are lengthy proceedings. Each side is typically calling a number of expert witnesses. Parents, you have to find and secure and pay for your expert witnesses. So this is a really arduous process, and it's also costly. It's emotional. We generally follow basic rules of evidence. They're not quite the same as a trial setting, but there are rules of evidence that you have to follow for presenting documents and examining witnesses. And the party that loses their due process complaint can file an appeal in federal court if they wish to pursue it further. So this is more serious litigation, and it is the point where even OAH, if you are an unrepresented parent, they recommend you find yourself an attorney. So this is a point where if you have started a due process complaint and you haven't gotten some legal advice, I would recommend that you pause and at least figure that out. I'm pretty stringent that I don't litigate a complaint that somebody else wrote. So if I'm coming in at that late of a stage, I am most likely going to want to pull that back and start over or write my own or make sure that it was done correctly. But for the most part, once you're in that due process arena, you're going to need some support legally or otherwise. So that is my kind of nuts and bolts presentation. And I don't know, I can stop the share and we can chat about experiences or other special education related topics, which is my favorite thing to talk about.
So I actually had a couple questions there about like the process. So the kids would be having to be testifying also. Is that true, or is that like just the experts, teachers, and parents and such like that?
For the most part, it is the parents and the experts. There are occasions where I do call students to testify, but they are usually teenagers pretty far into their education and have a strong opinion about the thing that we are having a hearing about. I do say I think students should start going to their own IEP meetings in middle school. I think they have to learn self-advocacy, not necessarily the whole meeting, but I think it's important that students are participating in their own advocacy process once they're old enough to understand and know what their needs are, and they could really start to grasp the process.
Mm-hmm. Did you have something, Esther?
Yeah, just tying it back to MCPS. I know for over the last year, fiscal year, their legal costs, legal fees on their monthly financials was the highest it's been in years. And based on the last item you discussed, is that the reason for that? Like that's when things have escalated to the courts and MCPS now has paid for legal representation to kind of, dig in their heels as this is kind of our position on it. Is that the result of that?
For the most part, most cases that are going to a due process hearing are a dispute over placement and what least restrictive environment is and who should be paying for what. And for the most part, if you're going to a due process hearing, they don't contract all of those cases out, but they have a relatively small number of attorneys who go to all the IEP meetings where a parent has an attorney. So there's only like so many humans who could do so much work. So I think that's where those come out. And I also think a lot of the, there's been non-special education litigation that has been a good amount of money recently as well.
That's right. That's right. And so I know as a parent, some of the things that I have learned that, I wish my younger self had known was when your child is diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder at age 3, it's important to place them on the, is it a disability list?
Yes.
Because it takes about 10.
To apply for the waiver.
Yes. And so we applied, well, his pediatrician, not his specialist, told us when he was age 3 to, sign him up to be on the waiting list. And the waiting list is right around 8 to 10 years. And so it was almost a year ago now that he finally got through with the autism waiver services. And so that's definitely one thing for parents. If you're already behind the 8 ball in terms of diagnosis after age 3, that you don't want further delay in getting on the autism waiver wait list, because it is about 8 to 10 years waiting for those resources to come through. And it has to come through before they're an adult, because then it's harder to qualify as an 18-year-old or above than it is as under 18. Would you agree with that?
Oh, definitely. And the thing with the autism waiver is it provides such valuable opportunities. You can get additional services covered. You can get speech and occupational therapy. There are also opportunities for respite care for people with more significant disabilities, and that can be really important as you go into your teenage parenting years. Yeah. So I would say the earlier you get on the waiver list, the more likely you are to have the support that you need when you're getting from little kid to big kid and then into teenage years and preparing for adulthood.
Yes. And one of the things I will shout out MCPS for is last year in their budget, they did allocate additional funding to add one more FTE to their autism waiver specialists to help draw down on that long wait time. And so that has been really impactful for my family, now being almost a year. We're actually in the reevaluation right now of the 1-year mark to see what resources my son will continue to have with the waiver program. And it absolutely has been game changer for me as a mom to be able to have that support. And and then also have that time to rest. Like, so there are some parts of his services that I can do myself, but then there are specific parts, I believe it is respite, where it's like, no, mom, you cannot offer these services because we want you to rest. We want to give you some reprieve. And I really appreciated that, where it's just, they provide a community of professionals that are, the background checks are there, that they're safe, low risk, to be with your child, to provide those services and supplement what you can do. So definitely it's a great program. You definitely want to get on there.
Yes. And there's only so many hours in a school day, and there are opportunities to get services outside of school that can be funded by the state if you access the waiver. The other time where those MCPS helpers are really important are when your kid is getting ready to turn 18 and they're going to have some things shift to them that they might not be ready for, like healthcare decision making. So there are also transition specialists in MCPS that help parents navigate that transition to adulthood process, which is really, really impactful for individuals with more significant disabilities who are going to qualify for adult services. They might be in MCPS services until they're 21, but you can start transition planning when they're turning 18.
Right. And the other resource that I have found helpful over the years, again, for parents, giving you the tips that I found along the way, is Maryland Connection. They have the LIST program, the Low Intensity Support Services, where it's a lottery system that you can apply for. There's 2 rounds each year, but you can apply for either round, but you can only qualify once a year, and it's up to $2,000 a year that parents and applicants can receive grant funds to provide additional care for your child. So like when my child was younger, daycare would be covered. And so that was great because daycare prices are really high in Maryland. Also, any technology devices that they may need, that also qualifies. Tailoring their clothes if they have certain types of sensory needs. But that's also a great program that the child can qualify for, and while they're waiting for the autism waiver to come through.
I've had families use it for like therapeutic summer camps to supplement ESY and things like that. So it can be really valuable.
Yeah, you just need to have an IEP, I believe, approved IEP as part of your documentation. So that's
get lucky to get a spot off that lottery.
Yes. At first I was like, I don't want to tell too many people about this because it's a lottery, right? But it needs to be not the best kept secret in town. Parents, need to know about this.
Absolutely. And I think, Esther, the other thing we wanted to talk a little bit about today are the changes coming from MSDE with respect to 3rd grade reading proficiency and students being marked or potentially retained if they do not meet those reading proficiency benchmarks.
Right.
So yeah. I have not followed this as closely as I probably should, but I think for me, the big thing is if you have a student who is potentially on that track where retention is recommended and they don't currently have an IEP, that's when I would be asking my school, is this something we need to look into more deeply? Do we need to do evaluations? Do we need to consider dyslexia or other learning disabilities? I think we have a much, much improved early literacy curriculum now, and it's probably going to catch more kids when they're younger. But if you get to that, like, oh no, we did not pass our proficiency, our MCAP for 3rd grade, and now we're flagged for potential retention, I would be having a very significant conversation. And I would say if your student has an IEP, I would have a whole lot of questions about the effectiveness of what is being implemented if my child was flagged for possible retention.
Right. No, I totally agree. And, it is helpful to return the power back to the parent to say if the parent wants to still have the child matriculate to the next grade level, that it does come with additional intense support for that child. So you're not just pushing them forward to push them forward. But it will be interesting to see how many of the MCPS elementary schools, I believe it's like 127 or 30 or so elementary schools. Hopefully none of our schools make it on that list of students where we're having to hold them back for 2 years in 3rd grade or additional year in 3rd grade.
it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And I think, like you said, you as a parent, you can decline. I personally think there's limited empirical evidence that retention does long-term good. So I think you have to do a real risk-benefit analysis there of what are the harms and what are the positives and what are the alternatives to retention. And is that something, there's a difference between being a little bit below grade level and a lot of bit below grade level.
Right. Because historically what I've heard, because I have asked, I feel like at a few IEP meetings for my son, because he was over 2 years behind in his literacy, it's, should we hold him back? And the team, majority, they said, well, the social emotional impact that would have of him not moving up with his peers, or, more the social emotional needs a child has in that age group, that would outweigh the benefits of holding him back for another year. And so I did yield to the, recommendation of the team. But it is something that I personally have wrestled with, because again, I'm focused on, well, if the work is getting harder and, reading is foundational to other subjects, if he's unable to read and he's moving up, now it's just more frustration is going to build. Now he's going to I think eventually he became borderline depressed, clinically depressed. That was during the pandemic, because he's like, I don't understand what's happening. Like, first you took away my whole structure, my environment, and now the work is getting harder. And I just, and so, I do think it's individual, child by child, know your child, know what they need. But it's a hard decision.
And if the answer is, we agree that the social emotional impact is too harmful, then what are we doing on the academic side to up that deficiency? Because reading is foundational. There is no subject in which reading is not required. And where I see a lot of struggle in all school districts, but in MCPS, when our learning centers end in 5th grade, and then we have to go to middle school, and we don't still have those smaller class sizes taught by special educators, well, what happens when we have to read grade level content and we have to write in response to grade level content? So these are the things that are becoming, I think, more complex as our programming needs, I think, are outpacing the number of programming options we have available.
Yeah. And, my son, he just went through that. He's now in 6th grade and going from the learning center. He's currently in the autism resource program, which continues a smaller classroom, but he lost, all of his classmates. They went to different areas of the county. And so it's that transition again with the social emotional and that community and rebuilding the trust prior to, receiving the information the teachers have. That is such a huge part for our children, because it took him 9 months when he moved to learning center to trust the teachers and what they had to teach him.
Yes. And to me, we look at least restrictive environment from the perspective of are our students accessing their non-disabled peers?
Right.
But we're not looking at least restrictive environment, and Esther, we've talked about this, as I am in this community and I have friends, and now I'm losing them because my community no longer exists in my feeder pattern.
Right.
And is that really helping our students? If the purpose of inclusion is to have community and to learn from our non-disabled peers and to be, one happy school and happy student, there's lots to be gained from inclusion. But if every few years only students with disabilities have to restart their friendship circles,
right,
are we really doing that well?
Right. And then I think one of the other kind of way to interrupt or disrupt that network is, okay, you have the child in the least restrictive environment, which may be the self-contained classroom with some gen ed pullouts, and then they make such great progress that they no longer need the self-contained classrooms. They can be in the gen ed program with the paraeducator and supports, and they're already out of their school, their homeschool model, because that's where the special program is in the county. But now that they're making great progress and they're doing what you've told them to do, they now have to go back to their homeschool and receive additional services. And so they've lost their community by doing what they've been taught to do. And so in a way, they're punished for making the progress that you've asked them to do, because now they lost their whole community. So it's just the whole thing.
Though I've seen students stay in the school in which their program is until they get to a natural transition. So that might only help you, through 8th grade. Because take, your son getting in the ARS program, he might still need some of these supports that are ARS specific, but be successful in a general education classroom for most of the day.
Right.
So I think being in a gen ed class for subject matters does not necessarily sever you from your program, but it certainly can. And I think that, there's also COSAs for that interrupts bus transportation. So we won't necessarily go down that road. But there are lots of students who are in discrete programs, but the amount of support they get from the program phases out, but they don't have to leave their school.
Good, because that means, you want to reward them for the resources are working, right? And then the last thing you need is to just disrupt that whole thing and then, have that attrition. But that reminds me too, with extended school year. So with my son, he has been with MCPS since PEP since age 3, and then prior with infants and toddlers. But he has gone to school year round with ESY services. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that and the benefits it has, really to just prevent any learning loss.
Yes. So extended school year services are something you have to be eligible for. It is in order to prevent regression that cannot be recouped within a reasonable period of time. You could also be eligible for ESY if you have severe interfering behaviors, if you are at a critical breakthrough opportunity, or if the nature and severity of your disability requires extended school year.
Right.
Extended school year in MCPS is 4 weeks, typically half days, and you are only working on IEP goals. So the goal is maintenance and to prevent regression. We are not necessarily introducing new skills.
Right.
And I think, if your student has a goal area of their IEP that is considered a critical life skill, which includes reading comprehension and reading foundational skills,
right,
then you can be eligible for ESY. And that's something that has to be determined annually. If your annual review is in October, you can't decide ESY in October. So you're going to have to come back probably after spring break and have that conversation.
Yes, but definitely to the parents for ESY, make sure you bring it up with your IEP team to get an understanding of, whether they would be eligible or not, and the benefits and the opportunities that exist. Because sometimes I think some schools don't offer lunch. I think that was one of the things I've heard, that, lunch may not be provided during ESY years.
I have not heard that one. That was
Yeah,
I know some non-public schools don't offer lunch and you have to brown bag it, but I didn't know that happened at ESY.
I believe so.
And I think something else worth highlighting is I talked earlier that sometimes an opportunity where a school district might file due process against a parent is for eligibility for alternative learning outcomes. So Maryland state law is unique that we cannot move a student from a diploma track to a certificate track without parental consent.
Right.
And if you've ever been in a meeting where ALO is discussed and determined, it is probably a 45-minute conversation of going through a very laborious worksheet that the state has issued. And at the end of it, regardless of what the recommendation is, mom and dad or whoever the educational decision makers are have to affirmatively consent to taking away being on a diploma track. Because even though you can go back and forth between diploma and certificate bound, once you are not working on diploma-based standards, it's really hard to go back successfully. So that is something that parents have to understand, make it through a really lengthy form, ask a lot of questions. It's also a time where you hear, quite frankly, a lot of negativity about your child, and you have to kind of emotionally brace for that.
Right.
Oh, I see we have a question from...
Yeah, let me put it up on the screen. So Jennifer Reisman said, "This is an excellent discussion. Thank you for hosting this. I'm curious if you want to discuss options for parents when the school system proposes discontinuing special education services due to a child meeting IEP goals, but a family worries about how their child might fare when their supports and services are discontinued, particularly at transition from middle to high or elementary to middle. Thank you all. Wonderful resources and conversation."
So I would say anytime there is a question about whether we should be exiting a student from an IEP, that is when we have to have an evaluation conversation first. Because meeting goals is wonderful. I love seeing goals being mastered. It does not happen as often as any of us would like. If you've mastered a series of goals, does that mean you no longer need that support in that area where you were working on a goal, or does it mean that you need a more rigorous goal? I don't know the answer to that question for anybody's child, but if we're talking about removing the IEP, the IDEA requires evaluations to be done prior to exiting a student from services. So that's when I would raise my hand and say, I'm so glad to hear about this wonderful progress my child has made. Let's reevaluate and see where that lands. It could be that it lands on exit. That's what happened with my middle child. Had an IEP, made it to the end of ninth grade, had a conversation about what do we do from here. Ms. Glassman, we think a 504, we think it's time for a 504. I said, okay, wonderful, let's evaluate. And then after we evaluate, that's exactly what we did. But I cannot make that decision in an informed way without actually seeing what the assessments look like.
Yeah, I agree. I think, once things are working well and they're making good progress, losing all of that support, I feel like it's going to put a shock to the system. That there needs to be some type of, warm handoff and evaluation, like you mentioned. But yeah, no, that's a great point. It's a great question.
And I would say, like, if you quote unquote graduate from your IEP to a 504 plan, good job, everyone. That means everyone has done their best and you have been successful and you no longer require specially designed instruction.
Right.
Great job to all of the teachers, to the parents, to everyone who made that happen. But we need to do, like you said, a smooth handoff. So what do you need at that point? A 504 plan could provide accommodations. Maybe you don't need specialized instruction, but you still need extended time, modification of, information broken down into smaller chunks, read aloud, whatever that might look like. You
Right.
can still need support, but not need an IEP.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Because some of the things that I'm experiencing with my child, it's exactly that. It's as we try to scale back some of the resources, we acknowledge, where is he behaviorally, reading, and his math, because his math is higher performing than reading. And so what would that need to look like to ensure that we're still addressing all of the needs as they're no longer at that same critical level of, significantly delayed?
Yes. And if math is his area of strength, is that an area where he can be pushed to a higher level?
Right.
And what do we do about the attention issues to make sure he can do that successfully? That's where a lot of accommodations come in.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
All those pages, our Maryland IEPs are like super duper long. So we have our small novel of present levels of performance, accommodations, and then supplemental aids and services. The accommodations and the supplemental aids many times can become 504 accommodations if you no longer need an IEP.
Mm-hmm. And so with an autism diagnosis, could you not have an IEP?
I know students with autism diagnoses that do not have IEPs, they have 504 plans.
Okay.
Those are students, those are generally speaking students who do not require specially designed instruction. So they don't need the reading, writing, or math support. And some of the social emotional goals are just done in a different way.
Right. Well, that's good.
So I got sent a question over here. Was there any discussion about how parents need their own experts from day one in special ed due to being told possibly incorrect information or not given correct supports, etc.?
So I don't think I addressed that specifically. I have seen a lot of variability in that. I have had parents who I have supported from day one, or have worked with an educational consultant, or had an evaluation done by a private psychologist and they use that person as an expert from day one. And I've had parents who did not feel like they needed an expert until they got to a point where things were getting a little uncomfortable. I think it's really important to know and understand your child's disability and diagnosis. That doesn't necessarily mean you have someone at every meeting with you, but you are seeking out some expertise so you become the expert and can call things out that sound like if something sounds completely incorrect and wild in an IEP meeting, it probably is, and you should feel confident knowing that if you don't have a third party with you. I don't want to come out and say that every parent needs a lawyer at every IEP meeting from, birth to graduation, because I think that's probably a little extreme. But I think there are times where parents feel that they don't have the pressure of having to have that wealth of information in their brains because they have someone with them who does it day in and day out. And that can be an attorney, a consultant, it could be a trusted friend. Parents can bring anyone to an IEP meeting who they choose to support them. So, your neighbor, your auntie, your friend who's a teacher. I have parents who have friends and family from out of state participate in meetings remotely. You can bring in whatever support you feel necessary and appropriate, so long as that person is appropriate in the meetings.
Yeah, one of the things that I started doing as a special ed mom is exactly that. It's helping newer, parents of younger children now entering into kindergarten, attending those IEP meetings, and even prepping the parents to say, well, when we get to the meeting, this is kind of just understanding, here's what's going to happen. There will be a team of people, but here's why, and here's what to expect, and ensure you're, really thinking about how long this behavior. So I think that prep has helped parents that are already feeling overwhelmed because exactly like you said, Kim, earlier in the presentation, the IEP meetings don't just happen, out of nowhere. It's the child was being sent home every day, or the parents were being called every day to pick up their child, or the child is having behaviors that is not conducive to remaining in the classroom. So there's a lot going on leading up to the IEP meeting where it's like the parents are already just feeling overwhelmed and sometimes just not, the best. That having another parent there that understands that world and understands what they're going through is really helpful in just helping the parents find the language to express what they need.
Absolutely. And I think it's amazing. I mean, I'm sure you're amazing at IEP meetings, Esther, but I think anytime a parent has someone who can help navigate the process with them, it takes away some pressure. I've gone to my own kids' meetings and been like a hot mess of nerves for no good reason. I've been doing this for 20 years. So sometimes just having a helping hand makes a big difference in your own stress levels.
Right. And it's like not against, but it's 1 versus like 5, right? And they do this all day, every day. And so sometimes it just the balance, it helps restore some balance between 1 to 5 people talking at you. Though they're there to help, but the optics.
And I think for the most part, like IEP meetings aren't often your favorite day of the school year. They're really stressful. Even when things are going well and you have a wonderful collaborative relationship with an amazing team, it's still really stressful to go into this setting that is mostly focused on your child's areas of need, not on how wonderful they are. And my favorite IEP meetings are the ones that acknowledge that and start off with everyone say something positive about this student. And that can set a tone. But for the most part, when we're at IEP meetings, we're talking about things that require support and help. And sometimes the emotionality of that is really hard because your kids are your favorite people in the world.
Yes. Oh, I have cried probably at every single IEP meeting, just every time, because they'll open it up to you and be like, hey, mom, they'll ask something. And then I'm like talking about the needs that I have. And I just start breaking down at the meeting, crying like, I really want to help, or this is happening. And so like, it's okay if you cry. They're not going to, shun you or anything. But it can be really emotional because exactly as you said, from the day my son was diagnosed till now, like it's very emotional thing that you go through. And I don't, you just embrace it. Say it's okay. Just try to, I do notes now. So make sure even while I'm overwhelmed, I have things written down to get my words out. But yeah, no, IEPs are something that you'd want to have some support with you, though they're there to help. It's just hard talking about your child's needs, especially if you have multiple children too, and knowing that it's unique to them. It can sometimes be overwhelming.
So I think we had another question come in.
I actually just put up a banner saying, oh, did we have another question?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I missed that. Sorry. Here we go. Koa says, when a student is evaluated for a 504 meeting, should there be both a psychological report and education report? Asking on behalf of a friend.
So it depends on what the areas of suspected disability are that we are evaluating. A lot of times a 504 comes because we've done special education evaluations and we've determined the student is not IEP eligible, but they do qualify for a 504. I'm going to back up a step. To be eligible for a 504 plan, there needs to be a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. Learning is a major life activity under Section 504. So are concentration, but also things like physical disabilities, walking, carrying, lifting, things of that nature. So if you are looking at something that has a potential learning impact, then a psychological report and an educational report are going to be part of your child find obligation to determine what the needs are. In MCPS, they do generate two separate reports. The psychologist does the psychological, the special educator does the educational. In other school districts in DCPS, it is one report all done by the psychologist.
Okay, great. I think we have another question here. Kim from Facebook said, how long are external private assessments valid, i.e. autism or dyslexia?
I would say at least a year and less than 3 years. The underlying diagnosis is going to be valid. The question that might come up if you're in that 2 to 3 year range is, can we make an eligibility decision with this information? And can we make educational recommendations with this information? So if you have a student who was diagnosed with dyslexia 3 years ago, that dyslexia diagnosis might still be valid, but do you need to update some of that data in order to write a good IEP? Both of those things can be true at the same time. An autism diagnosis is most likely not going away. You're an individual with an autism spectrum disorder. What might need to be updated is, and what are the educational impacts of that diagnosis that we have to program for in the IEP?
Yeah, I agree. With my son being ASD, autism spectrum disorder, we've only had the assessment done once when he was 3, and that has been in his files to move along with him as a child at MCPS all the way through. Even the autism waiver program last year when we qualified, I submitted that same documentation that he originally had for the autism, and they accepted it.
Okay, so reminder, if you want to ask questions, I think I got one more question coming in. I see it being written on my phone. But, if you are watching online, you can comment on any of the social medias, and we'll pop your comment up and ask the experts here. So let's see if I get that in. And I did have, so just while we wait for this, going back to the spending increase on the lawyer fees and stuff, and then kind of tying this back into the budget and also COVID. So, you said, I think 2 to 3 years, within 2 to 3 years is the time frame that you need to pursue one of these legal actions. Are there still things trickling in from during COVID, the FAPE stuff, or is that really kind of gone out and done now?
I would be surprised, because if you are filing a due process complaint, it has to be within 2 years of when you knew or should have known of the alleged denial of FAPE. So we are pretty far out from COVID that any of that would be a current violation. Theoretically, every student with an IEP, there was a conversation about compensatory recovery services. There was a decision made if you were eligible, and those services were either provided or at least made available to you. I don't think all of them were used. In fact, I know not all of them were used, but everyone should have had that conversation by now.
Okay. Looks like another question came in on the chat. This is a follow-up from the previous question. The child was denied an IEP because she was on a medication when the psychologist did the assessment. My friend is also paying out of pocket for OT services. What should my friend do to have that included in the 504 plan? The plan does not address social emotional needs that were noted on the psychologist report.
So it's very difficult for me to answer specific individual student questions without reading the evaluation reports. But I would say anytime someone has a question about services that are not in place, they should, if you're not satisfied with what's happening at the school level, those are good opportunities to reach out to attorneys and educational consultants, advocates, to have your concerns analyzed and see whether there is an advocacy opportunity there. Occupational therapy, MCPS says cannot be provided on 504 plans. It can. We don't, but it can. It can be on a 504 plan. You can have related services there. So the question is, does an individual student require that in order to access their educational environment if they don't have an IEP, or to access the curriculum if they do have an IEP? And that is something that requires some expert analysis that needs documentation to be read and analyzed. But one, there are dispute resolution mechanisms for 504, so you don't have the same menu of legal options, but there are you can object to a 504 going up the MCPS chain of command. And if the ultimate question is, should the student actually be eligible for an IEP, that is something that falls under the IDEA and special education complaints. The IDEA does say that whether or not one is on medication is not a part of the decision-making process for eligibility. So that might impact how a student presents and what their needs look like, but we don't decide services based on who's medicated and who's not. We decide services based on the needs of the student before us as they exist in this moment in time.
Yeah, definitely. You want to put back up your presentation with your contact information.
I was just
like
going to say the same thing, actually, is that we can put your presentation back up so people can get your contact info as well for
Awesome.
like the more specific questions. So great minds think alike.
And one of the things I was actually thinking about is with my son, they did prescribe some medications that after a while, like, I didn't think was serving him well. And I don't know. I don't believe it has impacted his performance in school, but as a parent, just knowing that you're always in control in terms of what you give and provide your child. And so monitor the medications, monitor the dosage, if it needs to be higher or lower. Always stay in contact with your child's doctor to ensure the medications are adequate so that they're available to learn in the classroom.
And I just want to point out that the decision of whether or not to put your child on medication is a decision that is between a child and their doctor that has nothing to do with school-based services. So anytime, it's okay for a school to suggest you have that conversation with your child's doctor. It's okay for a concerned teacher to say, I've noticed your child is really struggling with their attention needs. When you go to the next checkup, you should ask their doctor about that. But what shouldn't be happening is, we can't provide services because your kid's not medicated, or we can only, and anything that ties services to medication. I hope that makes sense. Like, we don't want to discourage well-meaning educators from pointing parents in the right direction. So that's the distinction there.
Yes, no, that's great.
Okay. So I think, did you want to share the presentation again? And I think Esther needs to cut off here, so we'll give her a chance to
Did I do that?
sign off.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me this evening, Martley MoCo and Kim. It is always a pleasure, having these conversations with you. I loved how we worked recently on special projects when it comes to anything MCPS and special education. So thank you for all the work you do for families like mine all around the county and the state, and just empowering parents to be able to advocate for their child. Really appreciate you and all that you and your company does for these children that are our most vulnerable kids.
And always thank you to Esther for being the awesome mama she is. Esther and I got to work together with MCPS on the strategic plan. We were invited by MCPS to participate in that process, so we will see where that goes in the coming weeks, months, and years. So,
Yeah. Well, thank you guys.
Yep. Thanks so much, Esther.
Thanks. Yeah.
did I successfully put that screen back up?
You did, but I was waiting for
Me.
her to sign off. Yes. So here's that information for anyone that has kind of more specific questions about where to go and what to, how to go forward and all that sort of stuff. And we'll just kind of leave that up as we finish up. There's a few. So let's see. I think we got a few comments. So Jennifer Reisman, what a great discussion. Thank you, Jennifer. And thanks for kicking off the comments and questions. I know it's can be a lot to kind of put yourself out there publicly for all the commenters. So we appreciate you all chiming in. I did have one more comment texted to me, which was basically about twice exceptional kids, and saying that I thought it might be good to raise awareness that gifted kids can have needs too. They don't need to be below grade level to need an IEP, and that's that was a comment just that I think it's addressed similarly. It's a similar process. Is that correct?
The process is the same. In order to be eligible for an IEP, you have to have one of the documented disabilities, and it has to have an adverse educational impact that requires specially designed instruction. Education and academic are not the same thing. So if we have a lot of 2E kiddos who are extremely bright, talented, and gifted, but might have attentional needs that require specially designed instruction to teach them the skills of task initiation and completion. So you can still be eligible for an IEP, but you don't need support in reading, writing, or math. You need support in organization, starting a task, completing it, following all the directions, turning it in the manner in which your teacher has requested. Absolutely.
Okay. Let's give maybe like another minute for like a final call for any other follow-up questions. And let me just see if anybody else had any questions on any other social media pages. Sometimes they don't show up on here if it's not done the exact right way, but I think that's about it. So thank you so much, Kim. And I think this was I learned so much from this. And I'm sure a lot of other people did too, but I definitely feel a lot better about knowing so much more about the process and how it works. And, obviously we have your contact information up here for if anyone needs more specific guidance. And I think that was definitely a really great show. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. I hope it was informative, but not too informative. I know this process, there's a lot of acronyms and a lot of volume to understand and get through. So hopefully it was beneficial information to share.
Yep. And I think, especially for the parents, I really liked your point about the students becoming more involved as they get older. I think it was your point, right? Not Esther's.
Yeah.
Because, I think that a lot of this probably goes over the heads of a lot of the students, but at the same time, this is what's happening kind of behind the scenes regarding them. So it's so good. I think it's, important to be able to be at least understand what's going on, and then they can kind of, like you said, learn to self-advocate because, eventually they're not going to have the same supports. They're going to be, either trying to get services as adults or, just kind of doing things on their own. So I think that was a great point.
And once they're an adult, they have to do it on their own unless there's someone who does not have capacity to do so and has a guardian. But once our kids graduate from high school and go into the post-secondary world, whatever that looks like, college, job training, if they need accommodations and support, they have to be the ones to seek them out and then access them. So at some point, they need to know what they need, and they need to be confident that it's okay to need that help in the next stage of their life.
Yeah.
That could be a whole separate show.
maybe another one. Yeah. And so with that, we'll say goodbye here and see you in the next stream. This will be posted to all the podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, and everything like that. Their recording is available afterwards on every social media that we posted. Yeah, we'll see you next time. And thank you, everyone. And thank you, Kim.